The tablet arrived in 14 pieces, wrapped in acid-free tissue, sealed inside a case with no return address. No auction record, no excavation report. Just a shard of baked clay covered in wedge-shaped marks, and a note clipped to the crate that said only, "Do not publish until TR anslation is confirmed twice." For 60 years, it sat in private storage, passed between collectors who couldn't read it and scholars who wouldn't touch it. Cuneiform experts who examined photographs in the 1970s flagged something strange in the symbol clusters, a repeating pattern near the edges that didn't match known Sumerian administrative texts, temple hymns, or trade records. It wasn't a shopping list, it wasn't a prayer, and nobody could agree on what it actually said. Then, this year, a small research team did something no one had tried before. They didn't hand the tablet to a single translator. They fed high-resolution scans into a quantum-assisted language model, a system built to hold thousands of competing interpretations in superposition at once, testing them against every known dialect of Akkadian and Sumerian simultaneously, instead of committing to one reading and hoping it was right. 96 hours later, the model produced a translation. The lead linguist on the project read it once, then asked for the room to be cleared. What came out of that clay tablet wasn't a record of grain or kings or gods asking for tribute. It was something closer to an instruction or a warning. And once you understand what it says, you start to understand why it stayed sealed for 6 decades. Let's talk about how a machine finally read something 4,000 years old, and why the people who built it aren't sure they should have. Before we get to the translation, it's worth sitting with how the tablet even reached this point, because the path is almost as strange as the content. The crate that arrived at the research facility carried no excavation permit, no dig site coordinates, no chain of custody beyond a single collector's estate. That's not unusual for artifacts of this age. A huge portion of the world's cuneiform collection moved through private hands long before modern export laws existed. But it does mean the tablet's origin can't be independently verified the way a freshly excavated find could be. We know what the clay tells us about itself. We don't know, and may never know, exactly which riverbank it came from. What we do know is that every scholar who examined it before now agreed on one thing. It wasn't safe to guess. A wrong translation of a damaged tablet doesn't just produce an incomplete answer, it can produce a confidently wrong one, and once a mistranslation gets published, it tends to outlive the correction. That's exactly the trap the earlier researchers were trying to avoid. Better to say nothing than to say something false and let it calcify into accepted history. To understand what makes this translation different, you have to understand why cuneiform has resisted machines for so long. Sumerian cuneiform isn't an alphabet. It's a system of wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay, where a single symbol can represent a sound, a whole word, or a category depending entirely on context. The same 3 marks can mean sun, day, or God, depending on what surrounds them, who wrote them, and which century they were writing in. Human translators solve this by drawing on decades of trained intuition, comparing a phrase to thousands of tablets they've read before, and picking the interpretation that feels right. It works, but it's slow and it's subjective. 2 respected Assyriologists can look at the same broken line and produce 2 different translations, both defensible, both incomplete. A quantum-assisted model approaches the problem differently. Instead of picking one interpretation and building forward from it, it holds many possible readings open at the same time, weighing them against every surviving cuneiform text in existence, only collapsing down to a single answer once the surrounding context makes one interpretation overwhelmingly more consistent than the rest. Think of it like predictive text on your phone, except instead of guessing your next word from a few thousand text messages, it's guessing an entire sentence's meaning from every clay tablet ever cataloged, while running thousands of alternate readings in parallel until one of them locks into place. That's the tool. Powerful, but only as good as what it's given. And what it was given in this case was a tablet that had already unsettled the handful of experts who'd seen it decades earlier. It helps to understand why this method exists at all. Damaged cuneiform is full of gaps, chipped edges, worn surfaces, missing corners, and a human translator has to make a judgment call every time a symbol is unclear, filling the hole with the reading that seems most probable based on experience. That approach has produced excellent scholarship for over a century, but it has a weakness. Once a translator commits to a reading early in a passage, that choice quietly shapes how they interpret everything that follows. A small early guess can steer the entire translation in one direction, and there's no easy way to know, from outside that person's head, how much that first guess influenced the rest. A model that holds many readings open simultaneously doesn't have that problem in the same way. It isn't committing to an interpretation line by line. It's testing the whole tablet's internal consistency at once, checking whether a given reading of line 3 still makes grammatical and contextual sense once you also account for lines 9 and 22, and only settling on an answer once the entire text supports it together. That's a fundamentally different kind of confidence than an expert's best. Guess? It's closer to solving a very old puzzle by checking every piece against every other piece at the same time, instead of one at a time in order. Here's where the story actually starts. The fragment measures roughly 9 centimeters across, small enough to fit in a closed hand. Clay itself dates, by material analysis, to somewhere in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Old, but not unusually old for cuneiform. What's unusual is the content. Most surviving tablets from this period are mundane by design: tax records, contracts, temple inventories, the paperwork of an early bureaucracy. Scholars have translated tens of thousands of them, and the vast majority say nothing remarkable at all. This one was different from the first line. The opening phrase, once isolated, translates roughly to, "What is written here should not leave the hands of those who guard it." That's not typical administrative language. It's not typical religious language either. It reads more like an instruction meant for a specific, limited audience, the kind of phrasing you'd expect on something meant to restrict its own circulation. The middle section describes what the translation team is calling, cautiously, a counting of cycles, a sequence of numbers that doesn't match known trade quantities, calendar markers, or astronomical records from the period. It isn't gibberish. The numerical pattern is consistent and deliberate, but it doesn't correspond cleanly to anything else we've recovered from this civilization, which is part of why the team is being careful not to overstate what it means. And then there's the final third of the tablet, the part that gives the whole thing its reputation. The surviving text there describes a kind of closing statement addressed to whoever eventually reads it. Translated conservatively, it warns the reader that understanding what came before changes what follows for the one who understands it. Not a curse in the dramatic, cinematic sense, something quieter and stranger. A suggestion that reading the tablet correctly comes with a kind of responsibility or consequence that the original writer clearly believed was real enough to write down. That's the phrase that stopped the room. Not because anyone believes ancient words carry literal power over a modern reader, but because whoever carved this clay nearly 4,000 years ago believed exactly that, believed it strongly enough to restrict who could read it and to build the warning directly into the object itself. So the real question isn't whether the tablet is magic, it's what the person who made it was actually afraid of. Let's pause here, because this is the point where the story could go two very different directions, and it's worth being honest about which one we're standing in. This tablet has not been examined by a broad panel of independent Assyriologists. It has not been carbon dated by multiple unaffiliated labs. It hasn't been peer-reviewed, published, or cross-checked the way a genuine academic discovery normally would be before anyone starts drawing conclusions from it. What we have is one research team's translation, produced with a genuinely novel method, of an object with an unclear ownership history. That doesn't make the story worthless. It makes it exactly what it is: a claim, produced by real tools, about an object nobody outside a small circle has fully verified. Keep that in mind as we go deeper, because what makes this interesting isn't certainty. It's the gap between what the words say and what we can actually confirm about them. With that in place, let's go back to the translation itself, because the middle section, the counting of cycles, deserves a closer look. The numbers repeat in groups, not randomly, but in a rhythm that echoes across the surviving fragments. Some researchers on the project have floated the idea that it could be an early attempt to track a recurring celestial event, something like an eclipse cycle or a seasonal flood pattern, the kind of practical knowledge a river civilization would genuinely need to survive. If that reading holds, the tablet stops being mysterious in a supernatural sense and becomes something almost more remarkable, a functional record of pattern recognition by people who had no instruments beyond their own eyes and centuries of inherited observation. That's not a small thing. Predicting a flood cycle without a telescope, a clock, or written mathematics as we'd recognize it today would have required generations of careful, patient record-keeping, and passing that knowledge down accurately enough that someone, generations later, thought it was worth protecting. That would also explain the warning. Not mysticism, but self-preservation. If a piece of knowledge gave one group an advantage, knowing when the river would flood, when the fields would flourish, when to plant and when to retreat, restricting who could read it wouldn't be superstition. It would be strategy. Ancient civilizations guarded useful knowledge the same way modern institutions guard trade secrets, except instead of a non-disclosure agreement, they had wet clay and a threat built into the first line. That's one reading. It's the boring one, and it's also probably the more responsible one. It's also worth pointing out what this reading would mean for how we think about early civilizations more broadly. We tend to picture Bronze Age river societies as primarily reactive, surviving the flood rather than predicting it. But agriculture along an unpredictable river only works at scale if you can anticipate the water, not just endure it. Every major early civilization that flourished near a floodplain, the Nile, The Indus, the Tigris and Euphrates eventually developed some system for tracking seasonal risk, whether through priesthoods, calendars, or oral tradition passed down through specific families. If this tablet really is an early physical trace of that kind of tracking, it wouldn't be an outlier. It would be a rare surviving fragment of something that almost certainly existed far more widely, but simply didn't survive 4,000 years of flooding, warfare, and decay the way this one piece happened to. That reframes the forbidden framing a little. It's less likely that this tablet contains something no one else ever knew, and more likely that it's one of the few physical copies of a kind of knowledge that used to be common, restricted, not because it was unique, but because whoever controlled it wanted to keep controlling it. But it isn't the only reading the translation supports, and the team hasn't ruled out the second interpretation. Mostly because the tablet doesn't make it easy to rule out. The closing warning doesn't say, "This knowledge is valuable. Guard it." It says something closer to understanding this changes what happens to you. That's a stranger claim. It isn't describing the value of information. It's describing a consequence tied to the act of comprehension itself. There are a few ways to read that line, and none of them require believing in curses. One possibility is ritual language. Many ancient texts describe understanding sacred knowledge as a transformation, the same way some religious traditions describe enlightenment or revelation as fundamentally changing the person who receives it. Under that reading, the consequence isn't a threat. It's a description of what the original culture believed knowledge itself does to a person. Once you know something, you can't go back to not knowing it, and that shift was treated as significant enough to write down. Another possibility is more practical. If the tablet really does encode a functional I, then understanding this changes what follows. Could simply mean that whoever reads it correctly gains real, tangible power over their own survival. Know when the flood comes and your harvest succeeds while your neighbor's fails. That's not a supernatural warning. That's a description of asymmetric advantage, 4,000 years before anyone had a word for it. Either reading is plausible, neither is confirmed. And that uncertainty is exactly why the translation team asked for the room. To be cleared before deciding what to do next. Not because they'd found something impossible, but because they'd found something they couldn't yet responsibly explain. Here's what we can say with confidence, and where the confidence runs out. What's established? The tablet is a genuine artifact of early 2nd millennium cuneiform, and the quantum-assisted translation process is a real and increasingly used method in modern Assyriology, tested successfully on other partial and damaged texts before being applied here. What's strongly supported? The opening line does restrict circulation, and the closing line does frame understanding as consequential. Those readings are consistent across the model's independent passes. What's plausible but unconfirmed? The numerical sequence as a flood or celestial cycle tracker. What remains? Genuinely unknown. Who wrote it? Why this specific tablet survived when so many others didn't? And why it was kept out of public view for 60 years by people who, as far as anyone can tell, never explained their reasoning to anyone outside their own circle. There's a narrower point worth adding here, because it's easy to miss in a story built around one dramatic sentence. The bulk of the tablet, the part nobody talks about in the headlines, is the numerical section, and that's actually the part the translation team is most confident about. The opening warning and the closing statement are short, and short passages are inherently harder to translate with total certainty, because there's less surrounding context for the model to check its own work against. The middle section is longer, more repetitive, and structurally consistent, which is exactly the kind of passage this method handles best. In other words, the part of the tablet we can trust the most is the least dramatic part, and the part everyone wants to talk about is the part we should hold most loosely. That last part is the detail that lingers, not the ancient warning, the modern one. Somebody, 60 years ago, looked at partial photographs of this thing, couldn't fully read it, and decided the safest choice was silence. They didn't destroy it. They didn't sell it. They just kept it quietly, waiting either for someone who could finally translate it correctly, or for a reason it should stay untranslated forever. Now it has been translated, and the answer the machine gave back wasn't a myth or a monster or a doomsday prophecy. It was a message from someone who lived roughly 4,000 years ago, telling the future exactly what they wanted the future to understand, and exactly who they didn't want to understand it. Maybe that's a farmer protecting the secret that kept his village fed. Maybe it's a priest guarding something closer to belief than to fact. The tablet doesn't fully resolve which one it is. What it does confirm is that someone, a very long time ago, cared enough about being understood correctly that they built a warning directly into the object, and cared enough about being understood by the right people that they built in a restriction too. That's the real discovery here. Not a curse, not a secret that changes the world, a 4,000-year-old decision about who gets to know something, made by a person whose name we'll probably never recover, translated for the first time by a tool that didn't exist a decade ago. We open by asking what a machine could finally read after 60 years of silence. Here's the answer. It read a message that was never meant for us specifically. It was meant for whoever the original writer trusted enough to hand it to. We just happened to be the ones holding the right tool when the seal finally broke. Whether that message was about grain or gods or something we still don't have a name for, one thing hasn't changed in 4,000 years. Some people would still rather protect a piece of knowledge than risk it landing in the wrong hands. The clay is new to us. The instinct behind it isn't new at all. Think about how often that same instinct still shows up today, just wearing different materials. A company guards a formula instead of a floodwater cycle. A government classifies a document instead of restricting a tablet to temple priests. A family keeps a recipe secret for 3 generations instead of 3 centuries. The medium changes: clay, paper, ink, encrypted servers. But the underlying calculation doesn't. Information is only valuable for as long as not everyone has it. And the people who understand that tend to protect it accordingly, whether they're standing on a riverbank in the Bronze Age or sitting in a boardroom now. That's what makes this translation land differently than a typical ancient mystery story. It isn't asking you to believe in something supernatural. It's asking you to recognize a decision. Guard this, restrict this, warn whoever reads it that reading it matters. Made by someone who reasoned about risk and value in a way that still makes complete sense today. The tools got better. The instinct to protect what you know didn't need to change at all. If you had to guess what that closing warning was really protecting, a survival secret or something closer to belief, leave your answer below. The tablet isn't finished giving up what it knows, and neither is this story. One more thing worth sitting with before you go. The tablet has now been read for the first time in 4,000 years, and the world it warned about doesn't exist anymore. The river it may have been tracking has shifted course more than once since then. The village or temple that guarded it is gone. Whatever advantage the original writer was protecting expired long before any of us were born. And yet the warning still worked in its own strange way. It kept the knowledge sealed for 60 years, even in the modern world, long after the reasons for sealing it had disappeared with everyone who understood them. That's the part worth remembering. Not that the past can reach forward and touch us, just that caution, once it's carved into something durable enough, can outlast every reason anyone ever had for it.